Today, I'm hoping to wrap up Matt Slick's long-winded formulation on tag by talking about his answers to objections brought against his argument. At base, I think there are multiple misunderstandings about how the universe works, how our brains work, and how language operates. Shocking, I know. Hi, my name is Scarlett, and I'm an atheist and skeptic. So yeah, tag, the transcendental argument for God. It's the presuppositionalist's go-to for God provability. It doesn't actually point to God. At best, it proposes some questions for further study about the universe and how we understand things, but it doesn't even get close to God. It is actually worse than the Kalam, which at least gets to something had to cause the universe and it tries to make that something God. Tag doesn't even really do that. It simply asks with incredulity, how can we understand the universe, and how can the universe be understood? Must be God. So, what are Slick's specific misunderstandings? First, that the laws of logic, which Slick calls logical absolutes, must have an author. Let's review what those absolutes are. Law of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle. I don't know about you, but nothing about that list seems deep or mysterious. Everything that exists is made out of smaller elements, atoms, cells, molecules, which cluster to form larger entities. And those are a separate thing, and that's your identity. Of course, we name those things and determine their attributes, but we'll deal with that in misunderstanding 3. Needless to say that we call a cloud is arbitrary. Language is all made up by humans. There's nothing essential about words. Slick adds to the list of absolutes, something can't bring itself into existence, and it is part of Slick's slipperiness or poor thinking. You can pick which. Yeah, rocks and clouds, examples he gives, don't bring themselves into existence because they aren't agents making choices. They are effects of natural processes. Clouds form because of atmospheric conditions, and they dissipate. We are capturing a moment in the rain cycle when we see a cloud. Rocks form when magma or sediment undergo pressure in our Earth. It is part of a cycle of our active Earth, which is always in motion. And while they last a lot longer than clouds, rocks are just a moment in time for those elements. They can be ground up, they can be pushed back underground into magma due to the different tectonic plate movements of our Earth. Slick also talks about fish, which is a living being, and living beings can reproduce and then they will die and those cells will decay and go back into the planet. Another example he gives of something that exists is a car, which is a human manufactured product made up of other things that we can identify like motors and tires and things like that. And those things are in turn made up of atoms and molecules, etc. So even this isn't like mind-shattering. So the second of Slick's misunderstandings is how our brains work. How do chemical states of the brain lead to logic? Must be some disembodied brain allowing that. I'm not a neuroscientist, so my explanation is going to be basic. Our brain has parts dedicated to bodily functions, out of our control, just making our heart pump and that kind of thing. Parts of our brain guide us as to what to attend to, what to actually pay attention to, what is important. Our brain has ways to store memories and information. And our brain has the capacity to automate some tasks. So if you practice something for a long time, it will come sort of mechanically to you. You won't be consciously thinking of every step. That's the case if you play a musical instrument or you speak another language, you just do it. You don't have to think about it so much. And all animals have brains that do things that are useful to them. Humans are animals, so our brain does stuff that's useful to us. I won't go very deeply into this because it's not the point of the video. It's just to say, if you're interested, there's a whole field of study out there about our brains, other primate brains, other animal brains, and so on. Evolutionary selection has shaped our brains. The last misunderstanding on Slick's part for our video today is how language works. It is one thing for something to be what it is and to have formed. It is another thing for us to find a name for it and to categorize it. On the one thing, all things that exist are unique. On the other, we can determine similarities that help us sort them into these categories. Basically, words are all human constructs, and categorization is a convention which can shift with new information. So on to these objections answered, which to me shows Slick's lack of wanting to actually grapple with the questions he raises. He wants to slap away these objections. So among some of the troubling aspects to how he shows these objections, one, I don't know where he got them. There is a note about iron chariots, which is down, and I'm not going to go to the Wayback Machine. I don't even know that they came from there. Number two, he doesn't contextualize them. Sometimes I have the impression the objection is someone looking for the right language to get through Slick's thick brain. Sometimes I think they're actually using analogies, and then sometimes I think he totally misunderstands the point. As we go through these objections, I just want us to keep in mind that for Slick, saying that something is what it is and isn't what it's not somehow needs accounting for. But God does not need any accounting for. God is the thing that can just exist. So having said all that blibbity blab, the objections. So objection number one, logical absolutes are the result of natural existence. So here is Slick's answer. In what sense are they the result of natural existence? How do conceptual absolutes form as a result of the existence of matter? Like, dude, you chose the objection. Why don't you try to figure out what this means? You're not actually having a dialogue with anybody here. Why don't you figure out? Slick goes on to say, number two, how does one chemical state of the physical brain that leads to another physical state of the physical brain produce logical absolutes that are not dependent upon the physical brain for their validity? And number three, if they are a part of natural existence, the universe, then they would cease to exist if the universe ceased. Of course, I think that's true. One, this is not proven to be true, and two, it implies that logic is the property of physical matter, but this is addressed in point 5 above. And that's based on his statement above that the logical absolutes don't depend on the physical universe to exist. They're transcendent and they would exist even if the physical universe didn't exist, but he didn't prove that. This is why I say we have to keep track of what we're talking about. We're talking about things being what they are. So A, we need things to exist, and then we need brains to note that they exist and to name them and categorize them. I mean, if there is absolutely nothing in the universe, then there is nothing to name, there is nothing that exists to name, and there's nothing to categorize at all. There are no brains to conceive of anything. There's just nothing, so nothing can happen. I mean, in some kind of hypothetical sense, we can imagine a brain that exists in nothing. Like, we can picture that. It's just a part of our imagination, though, and I think that's where Slick messes up. He's imagining a God that has all of this in his disembodied mind, but that is something that we can't even show. But we'll see this happen a lot with Slick. He puts the objection here, and then he asks a question back, even though the interlocutor is no longer there, and he doesn't even try to imagine what it is. He doesn't want to figure out the definitions or what any of this means. He just wants to throw this out there as if he's answered it, and he hasn't answered it. But let's keep going. Let's look at objection number 2. Logical absolutes simply exist, to which he says, this is begging the question by saying they exist because they exist and does not provide an explanation for their existence. Simply saying they exist is not an answer. All right, all my logical people out there, is this begging the question to have a sentence? I don't see a logical proof here. All I see is a claim that logical absolutes simply exist. I mean, I know that Slick wants an accounting for them, but once again, like saying that something exists and is a thing unto itself that we name, I don't see why this is a problem. That is just what it is. What else would there be in the world? In a physical world where molecules gather and we name them, we have brains that can name them, what else would exist? I don't know. But let's keep going. Number 3 is logical absolutes or axioms. And he replies with, an axiom is a truth that is self-evident. To say that logical absolutes are axioms is to beg the question by saying they are simply self-evident truths because they are self-evident truths and fail to account for their existence. Once again, people out there who know logic, is it begging the question to simply make a claim? Because this is what I see, that they are axioms. And I do think that they're self-evident. Once again, molecules clump together and we have a name for it. We note it as a thing that exists and it is what it is and it isn't what it isn't. I just have to say, I think that it is self-evident that things are what they are and they aren't what they're not. Okay, we're going to go on. Number 4, logical absolutes are conventions. And he gives a point number 1, a convention in this context is an agreed upon principle. But since people differ on what is and is not true, then logical absolutes cannot be the product of human minds and therefore are not human conventions, that is, human agreements. So I disagree that the statement is using an agreed upon principle because another definition of convention is a common practice. They don't have to be agreed upon. Like, to a certain extent, we can say that language is a convention. Nobody got together in a group and agreed that the word cloud was going to designate a cloud. It's just that people started using it, and there's this common practice of calling it that. Among other things, I think that he's just being flip here and not even looking at all the definitions. He wants to fling this down so hard, he won't even look at other meanings of convention. He goes on for this point to say, this would mean that logical absolutes were invented as a result of an agreement by a sufficient number of people, but this would mean that logical absolutes are a product of human minds, which cannot be the case since human minds differ and are often contradictory. Furthermore, the nature of logical absolutes is that they transcend space and time, not dependent on space and time for their validity, and are absolute, they don't change by nature. Therefore, they cannot be the product of human minds, which are finite and not absolute. And here is the slippage, I think. I think he wants to think that humans produced the logical absolutes as opposed to they noted that this is the case. And these are two different things. You don't need a perfect mind. You don't need a infinite or absolute mind to note that things are what they are and they aren't what they're not. And you can say to somebody, hey, did you ever notice that things are what they are and they aren't what they're not? And a person can agree with you. Maybe somebody wouldn't, but that doesn't have to be the case that everybody agrees. It's just something that experts would agree upon in this case. And he finishes up in point 3. This would mean that if people later disagreed on what was a logical absolute, then the absolutes would change based on vote and they would not then be absolute. And I think now he's taken this to a ridiculous end because I don't think the use of convention meant something that people voted on or that this could be voted on. And just once again, remember what we're talking about. Things are what they are and they aren't what they aren't. And we can find truth. That's all these things are. Again, I don't think this takes like geniuses to figure out. Let's move on to number 5. Logical absolutes are eternal. And he goes on, what is meant by stating they are eternal? Dude, why don't you figure it out? There are dictionaries in the world. Number 2 says, if a person says that logical absolutes have always existed, then how is it they could exist without a mind if the person denies the existence of an absolute and transcendent mind? After all, logic is a process of the mind. Now, I have no idea what the context of this particular objection statement was. I'm not sure I agree that they are eternal because I'm not really sure that they are. I think they require minds, which for all we know are human minds, and I don't think humans are going to be here eternally. But if it's simply that eternal means as long as there is matter and as long as there are human minds to note that matter, then there will be logical absolutes. But I'm taking more time with this than Slick seems to have done. He does not seem to want to entertain these objections, really. He wants to slap them down with a question, which in a dialogue, fair enough. But this is your blog and you should have a good answer for them. The number 6 objection, logical absolutes are uncaused. And he says, since the nature of logic is conceptual and logical absolutes form the framework of this conceptual upon which logical processes are based, it would seem logical to conclude that the only way logical absolutes would be uncaused is if there was an uncaused and absolute mind authoring them. What? You're saying that uncaused things have to be caused by an absolute mind? This makes absolutely no sense. Once again, I don't know where the objection comes from. I'm not quite sure what part of this they're referring to. I have the impression that this is something like it really just flows from the nature of our universe. And again, things don't have to be caused by an agent. Things can form, and in this case, we can note how things exist. I'm not really sure, though. Give me your thoughts in the comments below. Let's move on. Number 7 is logical absolutes are self-authenticating. 1, this means that logical absolutes validate themselves. While this is true, it does not explain their existence. I find it so funny, like he agrees with this, but if they're self-authentic, they just are what they are. A thing is what it is and it isn't what it isn't. This is all we're talking about. It doesn't cause itself. Again, it can form. And then he goes on to number 2, it is begging the question. It just says they are because they are. Again, people in the comments, please let me know if this is begging the question because it sounds just like a claim. It doesn't sound to me like a begging the question, but maybe I'm missing something here. Anyway, yeah, I think they are self-authenticating. You look out there and you go, yeah, that thing is what it is and it isn't what it's not. But God apparently is also self-authenticating and Slick is fine with that. All right, let's go on. Number 8. Logical absolutes are like rules of chess, which are not absolute and transcendent. And he says the rules of chess are a human invention since chess is a game invented by people. In fact, the rules of chess have changed over the years, but logical absolutes have not. So comparing the rules of chess to logical absolutes is invalid. This is maybe the best answer he's had so far, and I agree that it's not a great comparison. I just wonder what the person making this objection was trying to get at, because I don't understand it either. But let's move on. Number 9 objection, there are different kinds of logic. Yeah, there are. I'm not sure what this has to do with the point. I don't know where he got it. I don't know why it's here. But anyway, Number one, saying there are different kinds of logic does not explain the existence of logical absolutes. Number two, in different systems of logic, there must be undergirding foundational principles upon which those systems are based. How are those foundational principles accounted for? The same issue applies to them as to logical absolutes in classical logic. And again, I just have to wonder if the person saying this was trying to make another point. It really wasn't about the existence of the logical absolutes. It was trying to get Slick to think of something else. Again, not sure here. Let's move on to number 10. Objection: logical absolutes need no transcendental existence. Saying they would be true even if matter didn't exist is irrelevant because we're concerned with their existence, not their logical validity. Saying the idea of a car would still exist even if matter didn't exist doesn't imply that your car is transcendental. Reductio ad absurdum. You know, I have the impression that the person that made this objection was talking about some specific ideas that Slick was talking about, like the car. Like, it is ridiculous to think that a car would exist if matter didn't exist, or like the idea of a car would exist if there was no matter. Like the idea of a car is not transcendental. Basically, this just seems taken from some discussion he had and is not about the whole argument in general, and he's not really going to contextualize this very well for us, as none of these. Slick responds by asking, number one, why do logical absolutes need no transcendental existence? Simply saying they don't need a transcendental existence doesn't make it so, nor does it account for their existence. Two, also, why is it irrelevant to say they would be true even if matter didn't exist? On the contrary, it's precisely relevant to the discussion since we're dealing with the nature of logical absolutes, which are conceptual realities, not physical ones. And three, the illustration that a car would still exist if matter did not exist is illogical. By definition, a car is made of matter, and if matter did not exist, a car cannot logically exist. Well, I'm glad we agree on that. By contrast, logical absolutes are not made of matter. The objection is invalid. One of the things that I find funny in these is these questions back to the interlocutor as if the person is there and can answer. It seems to me Matt Slick wants to give the impression of having answered when he hasn't. He hasn't even really considered what's going on. But let's be clear. Of course, the logical absolutes are not made of matter. They're conceptual. They're abstracts. But they're abstracts that are talking about matter. You need matter to exist for there to be abstracts about them. They're abstracts that only exist because they are talking about the matter that is there. What a thing is and what it isn't. And that's what we're talking about. Let's go on to number 11. Logical abstractions do not have an existence independent of our minds. Oh, I like this one. They are constructs in our minds, i.e. brains, and we use them to carry out computations via neural networks, silicon networks, etc., suggested by the fact that logic-like language is learned, not inbuilt, balls in your court to demonstrate an independent existence or problem with this. This is going to be continued in the next objection, and I already like where this is going because I think that this objection is trying to get at several of the aspects we talked about earlier. These constructions are in our minds, so we need brains to do them, and our brains use the function of our brains to do this logic. Let's see what Slick says. How do you know that logical abstractions do not have an existence independent of our mind? Saying so doesn't make it so. He likes to say that. This is precisely one of the points about the nature of logical absolutes, namely that they are a process of the mind but are not dependent on human bodies because human minds contradict each other and are also self-contradictory. You would think, by the way Slick talks, that we can never come into agreement, that we're always going to contradict each other. I don't know. Anyway, he goes on. This would preclude our minds from being the authors of what is logically absolute. Yeah, we're not the authors. We're noting something. We are noting what exists. Just a reminder, we are looking at a thing is what it is and it isn't what it's not. That's all we're doing here. This isn't like rocket surgery, you know what I'm saying? Furthermore, if they are constructions of our mind, then all I have to do is claim victory in any argument because that is how I construct my logical abstractions. But of course, you wouldn't accept this as being valid. Therefore, this demonstrates that your assertion is incorrect. Well, I feel like you're claiming victory no matter what anyway, because you always pull out this trump card of God. But let's not lose sight of what it is we're doing as humans, why these things exist. We are trying to work together. So yeah, you could claim that and other people could reject that. But the point is to try to come together and find common ground on, like, there's a cloud, we're going to call it a cloud. This is what a cloud is made of. This is what a cloud does. You know, it's funny. It doesn't matter if it's logic, if it is the moral argument. It seems to me that apologists cannot conceive of humans actually getting together and in good faith trying to figure things out. It seems to me that they do just want to claim victory and have everybody pat them on their back for the genius. But the point of all this is that we are trying to communicate with one another. Let's keep going. Number 2 reads, how can an atheist logically claim that one chemical state in the brain which leads to another state necessitates proper logical inference? It seems quite unlikely, and without proof of some sort saying that logical absolutes or abstractions of human minds doesn't account for them. First of all, you don't need to be an atheist to figure out how the brain works, like what these brain states are, how the brain works, why it is we remember things, how we're processing things. And again, I just keep repeating myself, what we're talking about with these logical absolutes is a thing is what it is and it isn't what it's not. That's all we're doing. We're not doing anything more than that. We're not even coming up with more arguments than that at this point. Let's keep going. Point 12 continues from the previous objection. Logical absolutes are absolute and not because of some special quality, but because we judge them using logic. Therefore, their absoluteness doesn't arise from any special ontological quality, category error on your part. And I think we can say, yes, it's because when we look at what these absolutes are, we look for, is there a place where they don't work? And we don't find it. So eventually we say, I think that this is absolute. And again, we're talking about a thing is what it is. I'm going to just be repetitive like that. I wish we were doing something bigger than that, but it just isn't all that impressive to me to think of what these absolutes are. So what does Slick have to say? 1, you are begging the question. You are using logic to demonstrate that logical absolutes are absolute. You're not giving a rational reason for their existence. Instead, you assume their existence and argue accordingly. I actually think this goes back to their self-authenticating. You look at a thing, you go, yep, that thing is what it is, and it isn't what it's not. It's really not all that complicated. Is it begging the question, though? Please let me know. I don't know, maybe I don't understand begging the question. Number 2, furthermore, when you presuppose the validity of logical absolutes to demonstrate their absolute, you contradict your statement in the previous objection about them being constructs of human minds. They cannot be constructs of human minds because human minds contradict each other and themselves where logical absolutes do not. You know, Slick is really hung up on the fact that our minds are not perfect. And it's true, we do not have perfect minds. But for some things, I think we can come to a consensus. We can talk to each other, and we can build this. And again, what we're talking about is not that complicated. This isn't actually like calculating something massive. Number 3, where's the category mistake? Again, you're not talking to somebody, Slick. The nature of logical absolutes is that they are conceptual. Yeah, and conceptual means they're abstract, and they're in human minds. This is something I've brought out before so that their categories do not get mixed. The nature of logical absolutes is exactly relevant to the question. And I think that Slick misunderstood what the category error was. It doesn't have to do with relevancy. It has to do with that ontology, that it's not about what they are, it's about how we're judging them. Number 13 continues from the previous objection. Logical absolutes can be accurately described as conventions in communication. The fact that they are widely employed does not imply anything transcendental, anything more than the wide employment of the word lolly as something small and yummy applies, that the word lolly is transcendental, non sequitur. And I think that this part of the objection is getting at the linguistic part of the absolutes, which is that we call something by a name. It is not that there is like a Platonic ideal of a cloud and then we see a cloud and we call it a cloud. I think that's what this is saying anyway. Number 1, saying that they are widely employed does not imply anything transcendental is inaccurate. Something that is transcendental, as in logical absolutes, would naturally be widely employed because they are valid and transcendent. Otherwise, they wouldn't be universally used. You have recognized that they are widely used, but they are because they are transcendent. They do not become transcendent because they are widely used. And this still does not account for the existence of logical absolutes. I think the big miscommunication here is on the word transcendental, and the person proposing this objection, I think, is thinking of this in terms of something from the supernatural or the divine entering into our world. Like we don't have that kind of transcendental. The fact that a lot of people use that or a lot of people agree on it is enough for this to be widely used. It doesn't have to go into the supernatural. But you could also think of transcendental as being going above one individual's existence. So this is something that, regardless of an individual's opinion, that's one way we can think of it, transcendental. And I don't have a problem saying that these logical absolutes transcend one person's use. I mean, they do, but it's not transcendent in the sense of supernatural. You know, we can think of numbers or language as being transcendental in this way, that a lot of people use them. It's a convenient way for us to communicate information. That doesn't mean that there's some deity feeding this to us. We're only going to do one more on this because it's kind of repetitive, but I would like to finish out this objection in number 14, which is a continuation. Logical processes are clearly carried out by material constructs, usually neural or electrical. They do this without any known input or guidance from anything transcendental, which makes you wonder why anything transcendental is needed in the equation at all, parens, reality check. This is why I'm saying I think that this particular objector is using transcendental in a way of accessing the supernatural or a deity. And as far as we can tell, our brains evolved to be this way, to take in information from our environment, to make computations, to store memories, to store information and all that kind of stuff. And as far as we know, there's nothing that actually inputs into us. It's just we grow up, it takes a while for our brains to form, and this just works on its own. Slick starts out, you haven't defined a material construct or what you mean by neural or electrical constructs. If you mean a computer or something of that kind, this doesn't help you because humans designed them using logic. Yeah, go find out how brains work, Slick. He's talking about how our brains work. Our brains work by these neural connections and these electrical impulses. Come on, just go do some research. Don't just dismiss the commenter because it's not all to hand what the person means, or at least you don't understand it, I should say. If you mean that they are in the process of the human brain, you still haven't solved the problem of their existence, since the implication would be that if our minds do not exist, logical absolutes would not exist either. No, our minds exist. Those are the emergent properties of brains. It's the function of the brain. That's what we call the mind. The fact that we're sitting here talking, that we have language, this shows that minds exist. How they exist, that's a different question. And why they exist, well, we evolved this way. Anyway, he goes on. But this would mean that logical absolutes were not absolute but dependent on human minds. Just because they're always true and we can discover that, it's like these are different things. You can have an imperfect mind and discover good information. I don't know how else to say this. Our minds don't have to be quote unquote absolute to show something else in the world is absolute or to be objective. Back to Slick again, the problem would be that human minds are different and contradict each other, therefore logical absolutes, which are not contradictory, cannot be the product of minds that are contradictory. He bangs on about this over and over again. It doesn't have to be every human mind that discovers these or understands these. Just a couple of people or even one person can communicate this. And by the way, most people don't give a shit about these logical absolutes. The majority of people throughout time have not cared about this at all. And in fact, my friends who are philosophers don't care about these logical absolutes. They're very uninterested. When I brought this up, they've always gone in a different direction. So I don't know. You don't need everybody for this to be a thing. All right, let's see what else he has to say. Point 2 is, as stated above, how does one establish that one chemical state in the brain which leads to another state necessitates proper logical inference? The person just told you how the brain works. Anyway, asserting it doesn't make it so and concluding that chemical reactions lead to logical inferences has not been established to be true or even that it could be at all. Have you heard of experiments? Have you seen the scans that they've been able to do on brains? This was written, I think, in 2009, but they had already started doing some of this brain research by this point. And number 3, you don't have to know the input or understand the guidance for anything transcendental for the transcendentals to be true. And again, I think that we are slipping through language here and talking past each other. That's all I'm going to do on these. There are a couple more. If you're curious, you can head over to his website. But I think I'm done with Slick, and I don't know that I'm going to come back to tag, because I find it to be, like other arguments, lacking in real curiosity about how the world works. Mainly, I wanted to show how Slick deals with objections, which is to say he deflects pretty quickly. Although he says he has answered the objections, he really has just flung questions back at the objector. Instead of looking up words and trying to understand the point, he says, you haven't defined your terms. If this were a dialogue, the person would have a chance to respond. But this is a blog. It's Slick's blog. He could presumably look up the words, attempt to give the best interpretation of the objection, and think about it. It's a blog. It doesn't matter when he publishes. And then he can explain why it fails. I'm not saying these objections were the greatest. I'm not sure they were all objections to the whole argument anyway. Some just seem to address one part of the issue. But again, it seems to me that Slick thinks that these absolutes need to be authored by some absolute transcendent brain. And to be clear, I don't think anyone thinks humans authored the laws of logic. What human brains have done is examine the universe and note how things work. They don't need to be perfect or absolute to do that. And this thing about people agreeing, they don't need to. Most people aren't all that invested in logic. They are getting by in life, and throughout time they just wanted to survive. And our brains evolved to do that. And in the process, they were imperfect, but okay enough to do what they needed to do. But I think anyone paying attention would think, yeah, stuff exists and I can ponder it and categorize it. But know that humans have always disagreed on what things are called and how to categorize them and what their attributes are. Unless we're in a simulation, and then all bets are off. Well, that was a slog, but I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found something interesting, and I hope that you have found why tag is not the greatest in the world. And tell me what you thought of some of these responses to objections. Put it in the comments below. I look forward to reading it. You always find things that I can't see, and frankly, I can't deal with it all because there's so much in each section. The bullshit just never ends. And while you're down there commenting, like, subscribe to all the YouTube stuff. Algorithmo loves when you do the YouTube stuff. The simulators love when you do the YouTube stuff. And by extension, I like when you do the YouTube stuff. And if you like what I do, you can buy me a coffee. That link is in the description below. And I will see you for something completely different and enjoyable and fun and not a slog at all. See you then.